Hi everyone. So I have nowhere to go, but I decided to dress up, so don't mind my outfit. But today we're talking about David Chalmers' paper on panpsychism and panprotopsychism. This is a fun one, so strap in and let's get started. Suppose that you don't like any of the materialist ways of accounting for conscious experiences or qualia, and maybe you do, but suppose that you don't. But suppose that you don't like eliminativism either. You don't like saying, all right, well, maybe we're confused in talking about consciousness. We've got to get rid of that too. And suppose that you like some argument, like the conceivability argument for dualism. Remember, the conceivability argument says that it's conceivable that all the microphysical truths about the universe hold, but also it is not the case that I am conscious, or maybe it's not the case that the phenomenal properties are the same as with all the microphysical truths holding. And if P and not Q is conceivable, then P and not Q is metaphysically possible. And if P and not Q is metaphysically possible, materialism is false. Therefore, materialism is false. That's the conceivability argument. The zombie argument is a kind of conceivability argument. And suppose you like this particular causal argument for materialism. It goes like this. 1, phenomenal properties are causally relevant to physical events. 2, every caused physical event has a full causal explanation in physical terms. 3, if every caused physical event has a full causal explanation in physical terms, every property causally relevant to the physical is itself grounded in physical properties. 4, if phenomenal properties are grounded in physical properties, materialism is true. Therefore, materialism is true. All right, so if you like the conceivability argument for dualism, and you like the causal argument for materialism, Chalmers says, you should be a panpsychist. Now, it's a complete coincidence that I think I kind of happen to look like a psychic. It's just the headscarf. But what is a panpsychist? It's not a psychist. It's not someone looking into a crystal ball. It's someone who believes in the idea that some fundamental physical entities are conscious. That is to say that there is something that is like to be a quark, or a photon, or a member of some other fundamental physical type. So in other words, it's the view that everything is conscious. Hence pan, everything, psychist, mental, all mental. The view that everything is mental. Now, he's going to point out, because he's Chalmers and he likes categorizing things, that there are different kinds of panpsychism that you can adopt. So suppose that you're intrigued by the idea that like maybe there's something it's like to be quarks. Suppose that you like the idea of panpsychism, but maybe you want different flavors of it. So just for you, here are some different flavors of panpsychism. One kind of panpsychism is constitutive panpsychism. It's the thesis that macro experience, so experiences like mine, is or are wholly or partially grounded in micro experiences. So being a quark, there's something it's like to be a quark, but it's like a really simple something it's like. It's not a very experientially complex. But my macro experiences are made up of lots of these little micro experiences of microphysical particles. So micro experiences somehow add up to yield macro experience. How does this work? Well, you tell me. It's currently an unsolved problem for constitutive panpsychism. It's called constitutive because the macro experiences are constituted by the micro experiences. So the problem of how they all add up to make something complex and how they unify so that it feels like a unified experience for me, that's something that constitutive panpsychism kind of has to resolve. So unsolved problem. You could say it's simple addition. You could say that there's some kind of mathematical relationship. You could say that it has to do with the complexity of the thing that's made up of the microphysical things. There are lots of proposals for constitutive panpsychism, but that additive macro-micro question is still kind of unresolved. Now, what's a different flavor of panpsychism? Flavor number 2, call this Russellian panpsychism. And it's called Russellian because it's named after Bertrand Russell, who at one point suggested something like this view. Russellian panpsychism is the thesis that conscious experiences are quiddities, fundamental categorical properties that play the fundamental roles specified in physics. That doesn't tell you much yet, does it? Give me a second. Classical physics tells us a lot about what certain properties or particles do, says Chalmers. Mass resists acceleration, for example. Mass attracts other masses. But classical physics tells us nothing about what these properties or particles intrinsically are at bottom. So what is mass intrinsically? We're not sure. We just know about mass depending on how it interacts with other physical things. Classical physics, says Chalmers, studies the dispositional properties of physical entities. For example, the causal powers of electrons, which are things with negative electromagnetic charge, or the structural stability of an ice cube, which is, determined by the structure of water at a cold temperature, which organizes in a way that explains the macrophysical properties of ice. Classical physics, Chalmers thinks, has limitations in telling us what the categorical properties of physical entities are. We can characterize what entities make up some of the tiniest particles in the universe, but only in terms of the dispositional properties of those entities. For example, gluon, photon, up, down, and I'm gesturing up and down, but up and down are kinds of quarks. Charm, those are merely labels for entities that behave in observably different ways. So Russellian panpsychism is this thing that Chalmers is suggesting as an explanation for what the categorical properties of physical entities are, the things that they are intrinsically. And the categorical properties, according to this Russellian panpsychist view, are the quiddities, the what it's like properties. So there's something that it's like to be the up quark or the charm quark. And that is the thing that explains the dispositional properties of the quark. Or replace this categorical property explanation with whatever you think is the most micro property. So the dispositional properties are the only things that we can observe directly, but there is something that's like to be that kind of thing, and that is it corresponds to the categorical property, right? So what happens is that every physical entity then has something that's like to be that entity, and it can be described physically. So we have an explanation for cases like Nagel's bat argument, Jackson's Mary thought experiment, all of those kind of subjectivity problems for physicalism, and the non-physical fact part that are supposed to be problems for physicalism are explained as being components of the physical universe, but kind of from the inside, if you will. So according to Chalmers, Nagel and Jackson's arguments show us that there are certain kinds of properties that we have trouble knowing about merely by listing physical facts. So when we list physical facts, we list the dispositional properties, the structural and dynamic properties of things, but the what it's like facts are not dispositional, they're categorical. So this is what Chalmers suggests. Perhaps the categorical properties of physical entities are fundamentally psychic or proto-psychic in nature. So proto-psychic would mean that we have microphysical entities that don't have full conscious experiences, but they have like proto-conscious experiences. And it's unclear what that means beyond just that they're not entirely conscious. And that's just if you think that there's a different qualitative fact about being a microphysical entity. But maybe there's some quiddity there that explains why when you add up enough of the proto-psychic properties, you get a fully psychic property. On the Russellian panpsychist view, qualia are broadly psychical entities. But they're explainable insofar as they are the categorical properties, the intrinsic natures of physical entities, or perhaps the intrinsic natures of macro-physical entities, if you like panprotopsychism better than panpsychism. So what did we learn? We basically have taken some arguments that were quite strong arguments for problems with physicalism, and also the strongest argument in favor of physicalism, and we've kind of bonded them. So we get the fusion, the Hegelian synthesis, if you like, of physicalism on the one hand and kind of dualism on the other hand, or idealism. You fuse them together and you still have what looks like a monist view, a substance monist view, but where now there are two kinds of properties that are fundamental properties of the universe, the dispositional properties and the categorical properties. And so they coincide, they reside in the same place. You don't need two different things to exist. You just say that they're different aspects of the one thing that exists. All of these material things that exist also have intrinsic psychic natures, intrinsic mental natures, intrinsic conscious or proto-conscious natures. And that is broadly the view that Chalmers thinks is a quite plausible candidate for explaining the metaphysics of our world. He himself sometimes refuses to assert whether or not he is himself a panpsychist or a panprotopsychist, but it is clear that he finds this view very plausible because it has a lot of explanatory power. It explains why we get this intuition that Mary learns something when she leaves the room, or that there's something it's like to be a bat, but that, you know, scientific, objectively descriptive facts aren't going to capture those things. That subjective experience of the bat, that acquaintance that Mary has with red when she sees it for the first time that she didn't have before. So, you know, pretty cool view, constitutive Russellian panpsychism. It's interesting anyway. And in a way, it's like dualism coming back from the dead, right? Like if you didn't like Cartesian interactionist dualism because it can't explain the causal problem away, now you've got a sort of dualist alternative for Cartesian dualism. And actually, that's an interesting question we can ask. Are these views, is constitutive panpsychism and is Russellian panpsychism a view that is compatible with physicalism, or is it a dualist view, really, at bottom? Chalmers thinks that there's lots of ways to go on this. He thinks that there's some ways in which it is compatible with physicalism. So what he calls constitutive Russellian panpsychism is a view on which categorical zombies are not conceivable and not possible. So premise one of the conceivability argument will look false. According to constitutive Russellian panpsychism, you can't have all the microphysical properties be the same and have different constitutive properties, because those two are just fundamentally the same entity. So you can't decouple them. That means that according to constitutive Russellian panpsychism, that conceivability argument against physicalism doesn't work. And so there's a sense in which it's a compatible view with physicalism. Surprise! This view is also meant to be, says Chalmers, quote, compatible with a robust causal role, unquote, for both micro experience and macro experience. So the idea is like, you don't get epiphenomenalism because your mental properties still have causal powers. It's just that the causal powers are the ones that are associated with the physical properties of which they are constituents. So my qualitative experiences have causal powers because my qualitative experiences are fundamentally physical properties of physical entities with corresponding dispositional properties. Now, there's a different flavor of panpsychism that might maybe have a different position with respect to physicalism. So consider panprotopsychism. It's the view that fundamental physical entities are proto-conscious. Proto-phenomenal properties, says Chalmers, are special properties that are not phenomenal, but that can collectively constitute phenomenal properties. These properties are distinct from structural properties. So structural properties are like, you know, the microphysical forces around molecules, right? So H2O has some special bonds that it can form with other kinds of molecules, and that gives us some special structural properties. So H2O has special connections with other H2O molecules that explain a lot of what makes water important for sustaining life, for example. So those are structural properties. So the microstructural properties of H2O explain the macro structural properties of water that we see, you know, like ice, condensation, the ability for water to move up a plant when heated by the sun. All of that stuff is explained by the structural properties of water at a more micro level. But basically that is contrasted with the proto-phenomenal properties, whatever they are, of those molecules. The proto-phenomenal properties will collectively constitute true phenomenal properties, but they're not going to be identical to the structural properties. So Chalmers says that there's an a priori entailment from truths about proto-phenomenal properties, perhaps along with structural properties, to truths about the phenomenal properties that they constitute. On this view, the epistemic gap then is not a gap between the non-phenomenal and the phenomenal, but instead it's a more specific gap between the structural and the phenomenal. We might ask, is this view more or less mysterious than panpsychism? In a way, it feels more mysterious because now we have to explain what it is that makes proto-psychic experiential properties different from psychic experiential properties. What's the difference between the micro and the macro? What explains that the macro is constituted by the micro experiences? That's a big epistemic gap, but then there's also the epistemic gap between the structural and the phenomenal. It just gets really messy. Now we have some problems we didn't have before, and that feels unattractive. On the other hand, maybe you are pulled by the intuition that such a view can explain our intuition that we don't think quarks have phenomenal properties. They don't. What would it be for a quark to have experiences? Those experiences don't seem necessary to explain anything that quarks do. You know, they're not very sophisticated behaviorally, right? Whereas our conscious experiences are useful in explaining all of our behavior. So calling the experiences of a quark proto-psychic maybe has that appeal that it explains away the intuition that we have, that like rocks and quarks don't have, you know, complicated mental lives. They don't have much mental lives at all. But then we'll need to account for how macro entities do have mental lives, even though they're made up of things that have only proto-mental lives. What does that even mean? I don't know. We need to fill in that picture a bit more. Okay, so let's talk a bit about what these views are metaphysically. We've got constitutive Russellian panpsychism, and we've got panprotopsychism, and we've got other flavors of views that are possible, right? Because according to Chalmers, these are all kinds of monism. So they're all ways of there being only one kind of thing that exists. And he calls this Russellian monism, what he called type F monism in the previous paper, if you remember when we read Consciousness and Its Place in Nature. According to Chalmers, panpsychism and panprotopsychism are supposed to be species of Russellian monism, according to which all conscious experience is grounded in structure plus quiddities, but not in structure alone. So that's what distinguishes this kind of monism from a materialist monism that isn't panpsychist or panprotopsychist, or from an idealism according to which structural properties are not really explanatory. So are there physicalist versions of Russellian monism? Chalmers thinks there are. He calls one of these Russellian identity theory. Russellian identity theory says that proto-phenomenal properties or phenomenal properties are identical to physical properties. So they're not different properties after all. They're just different ways of thinking of the same property. But there's also non-physicalist, maybe, versions of Russellian monism. And what would these be? Well, Chalmers calls them a couple different names. One name is this thing he calls Russellian realization theory. According to Russellian realization theory, physical properties are realized by phenomenal properties or proto-phenomenal properties. So what this means is that the physical properties are explained by the phenomenal properties, but they're distinct. So the phenomenal properties realize the physical properties, but the phenomenal properties are in a sense more fundamental, more explanatorily fundamental. Because they're constitutive or intrinsic, they're the things that explain the behavior, but they're not identical. So it's a kind of non-reductive Russellian monism. Is this basically just idealism? Because if the phenomenal properties are more fundamental, doesn't that mean that we have an idealist theory? Well, Chalmers thinks there's a version of this theory that's possible, which he calls Russellian pluralism, that might not be fully idealist. So according to Russellian pluralists, some quiddities are phenomenal and some aren't. I'm not sure what that would be. I'm not sure why you would have that theory. That theory basically says that there is something it's like to be some microphysical entities or something like that. The quiddities of some microphysical entities are experiential, but the quiddities of some microphysical properties are not experiential. Yeah, I just don't know why you would posit that. What would be the reason for thinking that some microphysical entities have experiences, but others don't? How would you even find that out? Why would that even be necessary? I don't know, but it's there. It's a possible view you could have. You could also have the view that the physical properties are explained by phenomenal properties, and then you'd have a non-physical view. So, in summary, I think, this isn't the way that Chalmers puts it, but I think that there's roughly 3 kinds of Russellian monism that are possible. One of them is a more physicalist view, and the other 2 are definitely not the kinds of things we thought physicalism was. The more physicalist view is the identity theory, according to which the properties are the same. The mental properties and the physical properties are ultimately the same. They're just different ways of understanding them, but they're the same thing. Yeah, it's not clear why you would prefer this identity theory if you didn't like the other identity theories that were available. I guess it's maybe because you just like the idea that everything is conscious. I think it's more likely, if you're going to be a panpsychist or a panprotopsychist, that you're a Russellian realization theorist. And essentially that would mean that you're an idealist. You think that everything at bottom, fundamentally, is mental or proto-conscious or something. And that proto-consciousness explains the physical properties of those micro entities. So panprotopsychism is not exactly a physicalist view. That's what I think. I think it's a very tricky view. I think that Chalmers wants to say that panprotopsychism is at bottom a physicalist view with a property dualism. So it's a substance physicalism, but it's property dualist. I just think that the explanation issue makes it kind of complicated to make a case for it being genuinely compatible with physicalism. I think it's not. Maybe that's one reason why the conceivability argument is supposed to work, right? Because if we can imagine zombies, that's a dualist view. But if you're a constitutive Russellian panpsychist, then the zombie argument doesn't work after all. So why would you ever be a constitutive Russellian panpsychist? I don't know. I'm confused. We need to think about this some more. But here's a question for you. Do you like this kind of view, according to which there are fundamental properties that are conscious properties? And that's one of the reasons why consciousness is so mysterious. The thing that explains why there's something it's like to be a piece of meat is because there's something it's like to be everything. What do you like about that theory? What do you not like about that theory? And does it get itself into trouble that maybe you weren't expecting? Does it fit your intuitions? Also ask yourself, does it fit with any views that were and are popular? What does that say in favor of it? Do you think that that makes it more attractive, that it fits some ideas that people have had for a long time about what consciousness is? Or do you think that makes it suspicious? Do you think that we've taken a step back in our explanatory goals? Do you think this is an adequate response to the problems for materialism that we've been talking about so far? I want to hear from you what you think about panpsychism and panprotopsychism. But that's it. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you again soon. Bye.